So we've heard a lot about product, and I mentioned, I don't know if you remember, back at the start of the day, I said we were going to talk about two main topics, tools or products, and practices. So what are the right technologies to doing some of these things around teamwork, and what are the best practices? What are the lessons? What are the experiences that we can bring to play to best tap into everything that is available there? I talked earlier about how we're kind of maniacally focused on teams and teamwork, and that's both from my own background as well as Atlassian as a company. Interestingly enough, we did venture into, over the last 15 years or so, pretty much the entire duration of Atlassian's existence, looking at what I had mentioned at the outset of this event today, kind of what makes some teams more successful than others. If you look at, even within Atlassian, we evaluated 200 different teams. Some worked much better than others, and it's all the same company, same marching orders, more or less the same budgets and directives. And so what is it that the more successful teams have in common that the other teams don't? And we did that both internally. We also looked externally through a number of different, especially larger customers. And we did a bit of distillation in terms of figuring out what, quote, the perfect team looks like, or what some of the attributes are of a perfect team. I'm going to itemize them here. And as I do, I want you to each be thinking about how many of these attributes you can ascribe to your own teams. So just kind of tick them off on your own as I go through. How many of you work on teams today that have clearly defined processes, that have strictly defined and measured outputs, that are able to manage risks effectively in order to reduce, if not eliminate, variability, that have clearly identified and structured roles, that have a strong and smart leader? Don't lie, even if your manager's here, it's okay. That have personalized and customized tools for you to use on the job, and that has a stable and unchanging team. So tally that up in your head. And I'm curious, how many of you happen to hit all 7? How about 6? 5? 1 hand. 4? 1, 2, 3. 3? Yeah, not a lot. 2 or 1, I'm probably going to get most of the hands coming up at this point. Can you guess what this company might be? Ideas that come to mind is maybe it's Amazon, maybe it's Google, maybe it's Disney, maybe it's Atlassian. Hint, it's not Atlassian. Who is this mythical organization, and how do they manage to hit each of these attributes? Well, it's this gang. It's a very different team than what you guys probably had in mind. This is, in fact, a bunch of steel workers in Pennsylvania that were able to refine their work activities in the 19th century, 1890s, and they came up with the optimal tool configuration that they needed. The precise weight, 21 pounds or about 10 kgs, that should be in each shovel for their teams. They were able to pair that up with very clearly defined breaks throughout the day to keep everyone kind of at peak performance. And they made a number of other improvements that ultimately allowed them to take the efficiency for each of their workers in terms of coal they could move from, it's a staggering number when you think about it, a person doing this, right? From 12 to over 47 tons per day. So this was their world. This is what they were able to achieve. And you think that's impressive, and we should try to replicate that somehow. And many of us do try to get back to some of these attributes. But should we be? No. This is beyond old school mentality. This is something that was literally designed for a couple of centuries ago. The answer is we shouldn't be trying to do this. But the reality is quite often some companies and some managers do. This world was very different. It was very predictable. How many of you can honestly say that when you come into work in the morning, your day goes exactly as you planned by the time you leave in the afternoon. I mean, I'd be shocked if anybody were honestly able to raise their hand. I know for myself in my own role, it's even worse. I'll try to plan out where I think my day should be, and I go through a number of twists and turns, and it runs off the rails in a good way. But you literally never know where you're going to get to from when you come into the morning to the end of the day. And so our world is anything but predictable. Our world is all about being unpredictable, especially in technology. I mean, if you want stability, don't work for a software company. It's just change is beyond rapid. And that's just the reality of the world that we work in. So before we try to leverage a lot of these tools, we really should pull back and think about what's the right way to approach them. What's the right team structure? What's the right mindset? What's the right practice that we need to take on board? The right discipline so that we use those tools most effectively. And you only have to look at yourself, and somebody, I think it was Steve, stole a little bit of my thunder. I don't know if you saw my slide deck. But when you go back 10 years, because you mentioned one of these examples I'm going to put up here, I don't think 10 years ago we could have imagined what it really meant in terms of mobile phones and cameras, and the fact that there's over 1 trillion selfies taken every year. I mean, that's an amazing, a staggering amount of images that are constantly being captured. Or the example that I thought I heard being mentioned earlier, Bitcoin. Like, who could have envisioned that some anonymous person literally created their own currency that at one point had a net worth of $165 billion, which, by the way, is almost equivalent to the GDP of New Zealand. It's just unreal that these are the types of innovations that come up. And not only in terms of just taking images, especially off of mobile, but a world in which automation is in place so that machines are actually becoming better at recognizing what's on the image than we are. I mean, think of something that we all experience day to day on Facebook. I'm astounded that old photos will be scanned into me from my family, and it's still able to say, do you want to tag yourself in this photo, or your sister? Like, it's unreal how it's able to do that so effectively. Sometimes more for social purposes, sometimes maybe for not so practical implementations, being able to distinguish fried chicken from labradoodles. But machines can pick these things out. They can apply these algorithms to distinguish probably more effectively than I can in this photo. I think I'd be eating half of the wrong things. But it's amazing that it can do that. And we laugh about it and we think there may not be a lot of practical applications, but there are. When you take those same algorithms and you apply them to medicine. I mean, my partner is an emergency doctor. It's all about reading information like this. And if we can automate that, if we can apply technologies to more quickly diagnose diseases, I mean, this is quite literally life-changing. It's amazing, some of these technologies that are there. And not only around diagnostics, but even things that are done in the operating room. I mean, having 3D printers to now manufacture organs. It's still maybe a little bit early for a heart, but we're certainly working in a world, and who knows, 10 years from now, where we might be with this. Some things that we have today, 10 years ago, I don't think we ever would have imagined. And so I honestly believe that it's not an understatement to position that we are living in pretty much a magical era. It's insane, the things that we're able to do every month, every year, the things that come out. And so that's a large part of why Atlassian is really excited to be working in this space, because all of these advancements involve teams and more effective teamwork. It also means that we can no longer just simply optimize for efficiency. That's old school, right? We need to be thinking about how do we make teams work better together, and what are some of the practices around that. Just quickly, I wanted to reintroduce a couple of slides that I mentioned earlier, where you would hope that everything's fairly open and accessible, even just within a company, that all the different teams are using all the different Atlassian products with all their productized integrations, and information just flows seamlessly. But unfortunately, that's not the reality. Things are not always that well integrated And there are a lot of products that form our constellation of what we have to contend with. And this is true even inside of Atlassian, right? We use Salesforce. We use a number of different items that are here. I'm sure you guys do as well. And it's this complexity that makes it quite challenging to just harness together a lot of information that's resident across teams. I spoke earlier on the product front of being able to unify that and talking to some newer applications that Atlassian's making available. But amongst all of that, what we're trying to do is really address moving from this predictable mindset to something that's much more chaotic and unpredictable. Moving away from centralized decision-making, kind of a top-down command and control structure, to delegating and empowering teams. Doing it in a way that dramatically increases the velocity. Speed is crucial here. And also to do it so that looking at different variations is a good thing, not bad. So again, it's a definite shift in mindset. No more control tower, let the team sort it out. This is well in tune with agile methodology for those of you who have been through this. No perfectly optimized decisions. Don't let perfect get in the way of good. Decide and learn. Get it out there and see how you go and keep going. Eliminating variability? No, encourage experimentation. Give it a shot, see how it works, measure it, pivot, lather, rinse, repeat. Right? And this is something that we do quite extensively inside Atlassian. We won't talk about our initiative here. We'll talk about our experiment. Here's how we're going to change and experiment for this campaign or for this particular product. We are constantly experimenting. And sometimes it works out well and sometimes we fail. But we learn from the failures just as much as all the successes as well. From the boss as the expert to, no, ideas come in a number of places. I mean, I work in a role where I don't currently manage a team, but I would hope I have experience in my background where I can probably give guidance to other parts of the organization. And I do. That's all accessible. I'll quite often be a part of a number of teams where I'll give my say, and vice versa. We'll get input from various parts of the company as well. Moving from static teams to something that's a bit more matrix aligned, much more fluid and evolving. And from a world in which everything was structured around teams to avoiding conflict, to controlling the design, to embracing that friction. There's nothing wrong with having a healthy debate. You have to have the right culture and the right mindset and the right ability to express yourself in a safe way in order for that to occur. But certainly there's nothing wrong with having a bit more of a debate on things over time. So how do we move from those older management practices to the reality of the way things work today? The biggest force multiplier around this is this concept of being open. And again, it's something I touched on this morning. I'll reintroduce it here as well. So open in a number of ways, because when teams are open, they build trust faster, they create stronger connections, and they operate at higher speeds. In fact, when information flows freely across the organization, it gives everyone the right context to unlock all of their ideas. So how are we open? Well, 3 primary ways that we can look at this. An open way of working, this transparent flow of information. One of our co-CEOs, he constantly comes back to this idea of the truest measure of success for sharing information is how it gets from its source to where it's needed in the organization. And as you can imagine, with a number of different data silos, even inside Atlassian, different Jira and Confluence installs, much less other products we might be using, it can impede that velocity, right? So that to the extent to which we can tighten that up, that we can open up our way of working, that we can ensure where appropriate, some information we don't necessarily want it always shared internally. But Atlassian, by and large, is fairly open with a lot of information to ensure that it gets to where it can be most effectively used. So an open way of working is number one. An open way of thinking, it really becomes a core part of the way that we operate day to day. Any ideas that you have, any brainstorming, being able to loop in other individuals, whether or not they're part of your core team, that's what we mean by an open way of thinking, to engage, to discuss, to debate. There's nothing wrong with tying other people. There isn't this mentality inside of Atlassian of, that's not my job, or I can't add value in some way. Job defines what your focus is on a daily basis, but it definitely doesn't exclude you from getting into other things as well. And lastly, an open way of being. This can seem a little more esoteric, but it really has an important impact on productivity. If you think of jobs that you've been at in the past, and I've certainly been through this, there's your work self and there's your home self, right? And it's not like you're quite Jekyll and Hyde. You're not two different people. But the way that you conduct yourself, the way that you operate around your coworkers is not always exactly the same as the way you operate with your friends or your buddies that you hang out with at the pub. To the extent to which you can remove that you feel comfortable in your company, in your work culture, that you can just be who you are, that you just show up and you're the same person you are when you're at home, that removes a tremendous cognitive load, right? You don't always have to filter and throttle and be very conscious and deliberate about what you're going to do or what you're going to say, or be worried about how it's interpreted. You have enough trust. You feel secure enough in your company that you just show up and you work. And I experienced this directly from when I interviewed to when I started as an Atlassian. The same people operated the same way from when I was interviewing to when I started working on the team. There were no surprises. I knew exactly what my manager was going to be like. I knew exactly how my peers were going to operate. I knew exactly what my main job responsibilities were going to look like. And when I started, there was never that aha moment where I thought, ooh, shoot, I kind of missed that one. Or I didn't sense that was really what they meant. There was no ambiguity. It was a very open way of working and thinking and being. And each of these culminate into one of Atlassian's core company values. I normally don't use any swear words, but it is in our culture. It's actually right up here on the slide at an event. But one of our core values is open company, no bullshit. Very Australian, very just out there and plain in black and white. But it is part of our ethos, right? We are open, arguably to a fault. And this, along with some of our other values, drives the way that we operate on every day inside the company. So openness isn't just a marketing tag. It definitely isn't a new concept for Atlassian. It very much is embedded in our DNA in terms of how we operate day in and day out. So it's very central to our culture. All of this wraps up into what I talked about this morning around team playbooks. So again, we talked about products. Now let's look at practices. Team playbooks are used every day by all of our Atlassians. So again, I've mentioned to a couple of people during the breaks, we have about 3,000 employees now, and that's growing at a pretty good clip. So our teams are changing and evolving. They've done health checks in the past to gauge current state, and they'll continue to track that over time to see how the team itself is working and use a number of plays that we give them in these playbooks to figure out, for any weak areas, what do you do to improve them? And the team playbook is a collection of exactly that. What's the health check? What's your baseline? What's your current read on where you're at today? What are the different plays that you can use to mitigate that? What are the exercises around that? And this was a packaged result of a number of iterations of us looking at our own teams internally, as well as some of our biggest customers. Again, those attributes that I outlined on the front end for the more predictable environment, we now have counterparts to that in the terms of a health monitor, one example of which is shown here, for the current state of your team today. And a couple of things to call out here. Companies are quite often focused on how the company is doing, maybe how the department is doing, and how the individual is doing, right? We all go through annual HR reviews. Those processes are always there. But when you're trying to improve teamwork, doesn't it then make sense to figure out how is the team working? So the first part of our team playbooks is assessing that with a health monitor. And it's very simple. There are a few attributes that you see here around owner and balanced team and shared understanding and values and metrics. And there are descriptions underneath each of these as you pull down these documents. But everyone on the team gets a vote. So I did this for my own team internally a couple of weeks ago in the US, and 6 of us sat around and we each had these cards that we got to post up on the window essentially. What's your understanding of who's actually running things? Do we have the right resources on the team? What's our mission statement? Do we have the right measurements? And so on and so on. And we came up with a good amount of greens and a few yellows and 1 red. The interesting thing was, if we were off by a measure across people, it was maybe by 1 color level. There were no like green to reds. There wasn't anything that drastic. But the areas that were really weak, pretty much everyone on the team saw it. There was 1 line item that every single person that voted was red. We're like, right, that's the one where we're going to start. That's something we need to have more of a discussion on. And then we went through the yellows, and then we made sure the greens were sanity checked as well. But start by taking a read on where your team is at today, and then look how that evolves over time. Do it whatever frequency makes sense for you, every 6 months, every year, whatever makes the most sense for your area. And see how it changes. See how your practices around that potentially move these as well. Off of doing that health check, we'll then give you a series of plays. Plays in terms of almost like a sports metaphor, right? If you encounter this issue, try this out. And we won't give you the exact resolution. Of course, we couldn't, right? There's so many permutations on this. But we'll give you some common thoughts and ideas. Discuss this or look at that, or maybe try this approach or that approach. Whatever directions are given, though, it's something that's always discussed as a team. Action items are agreed to, and then ownership is assigned, and you move forward from there. And then again, every few months, you come back, you reassess, you see where you're at, do a typical retro, right? What worked well, what didn't work well, what are we going to do differently next time, and move forward from there. So health check, then the different practices, and along the way, as part of that, understanding how you know if those things were met. Right? I mentioned earlier about how do you know if you succeed? This is one of the phrases that you'll hear quite often inside the company. All right, we defined all this. We know where we're at. We're going to try these 3 things. But how do we know if we did them? Agreeing to what success looks like. And that speaks to OKRs. And OKRs aren't something that Atlassian came up with. This is something that Google made pretty popular back a few years ago. But we'll give you some guidance and recommendations on what these OKRs should be. And I would strongly advise taking a look at, within the context of playbooks, how to best implement these. Because it was only a few years ago at Atlassian where one of our big buzzwords was thrashing, right? We knew we wanted to do a lot, and we're like, oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And, oh, that's really cool, I'm going to get on that. And then the day ends, and you're like, I don't know if I actually achieved anything useful because I just thrashed on so many different things. And a large part of the company was afflicted with that. OKRs are a key way to help keep you on track, to help prioritize your work constantly. And they give you a goalpost for not only just metrics, but I would even draw my attention more to the center here, right? A shared understanding for the team, first and foremost. Everyone has consensus on what you're doing, why, and how. Then you can look at how to measure it. Then you can look at the speed at which you're actually getting it done. Whether you use OKRs straight up, whether you use another metric designation, whether you customize it, as we've done, doesn't matter. Measure it somehow and make sure it sticks to the results of the different plays that you've come out with. So try it. We give you some templates as part of the packaging for that. If you use Confluence, great. You've got templates, blueprints that you can spin up and not only define these, but share them with other teams inside the company as well, right? Being open. And I was having a chat with someone during one of the breaks, and they said, oh, this is great, but when we define this, how does this team over here know about it, or this other team who might have some dependencies on it? I said, just share it. Spin up a Confluence page. It's there by default. Just let everyone have their say and add comments and be part of that discussion. So start there. Health check, plays, OKRs. I'm going to pause. I'm going to test people's knowledge of Atlassian. And I'll be really impressed if somebody gets one of these 2. But in terms of OKRs, in terms of objectives, I want you to imagine you're one of our co-founders, right? Who knows our co-founders' names? We have 2. This isn't the question, but who knows? You answer, yeah. Mike Cannon-Brooks and Scott Farquhar, exactly. Or Mike, and as we like to call him on my team, the other Scott. So Mike and Scott, when they started the company, they had 2 very simple objectives. 2 ways to measure their own idea of success. So if you're somebody who's spinning up this company that we're going to call Atlassian, and you know at the time you're going to focus on bug tracking, what would you imagine at that point in time, 15 years ago, would be one of your 2 objectives? So think about it, and I definitely want a couple of answers. Take a guess. Can't hurt if you're wrong. But I'd be curious if anyone can get at least one of these. If you were in that mode, you're coming just out of uni, you're spinning up a company with your mate, you've got a couple of very simple goals, like we're gonna make Atlassian, and I just want to be able to do 2 things out of it, and I'll be happy. What are those 2 things for you? What does success look like for you? Anyone? Who's bold enough to take a guess and even be wrong? To get a certain number of people to buy software? Close, but not quite. You're going down the right general category, but almost there. Anyone? So shy. Yeah. Number of users using the software? Close. You would think it would be that, right? Yeah. Improving the way of working. If it were 10 years later, you'd be right. This was like way before that, though, but good guess. Yes, I'll take one more. Software as a service. SaaS offerings. No, wasn't it at that point. All right. Remember, you're in uni, right? You're 20-ish years old, and you want to spin up this company. And according to Scott Farquhar, they had 2 original goals for the company. One was simply to earn more than $48,500 a year. Because he knew if he took a job offer at that point in time, it would probably come in around that mark. So he's like, if I can meet par with that, if I can earn that much income a year, happy chappy, right? We're good to go. The other one, and this is very insightful on 2 fronts. One, it speaks to Atlassian as a company and our co-founders. 2, it's very, very Aussie. The other objective was to not have to wear a suit to work. Literally. And he's written a blog post around this, so this is no joke. So this was their idea of success, right? I want to start a company with my mate. I just want to make sure I can make, we'll round it up and call it $50K a year, and whatever happens, I don't want to wear a suit to work. That's it. That's their idea of success. I think it's safe to say they kind of blew through that and then some, 15 years later. But it's interesting to see what their original goal was. And it also speaks to the importance of setting stretch goals. Goals that in your wildest dream you think you can't hit. Because, again, look where Atlassian is as a company now that they never would have thought of attaining 15 years ago. And we do that internally as well. We set a reasonable goal and we set a stretch goal or a BHAG goal. Anyone ever heard BHAG before? Big, hairy, audacious goal. Like just some ridiculous, we don't think we'll actually get there, but let's try for it. And you know what? Sometimes we actually do really well on our stretch goals. So don't ever just settle for a mediocre goal. Don't settle for just what's attainable. Shoot higher. Because there's a good chance with your teams that you might be able to get there. Anyway, interesting little bit of reflection on the company. Other aspects of what's included in the team playbooks are something basic like a project poster. Allowing everyone to see a certain initiative that you're working on and why. Gives you the idea of sharing a lot of common elements to be able to share the specific results that you're aiming for, and distribute that through the entire company as well. It's essentially just a way to build a shared understanding across teams of here's what we're working on, here's what we think it'll take, here are the main reasons why we're doing it. But it's basically a one-pager. It's not meant to be an exhaustive business requirements document or anything crazy like that. But it's just enough of a sense of here's what we think we need to be doing and why, whether it's for a particular project or a particular team. Again, it gives you that shared understanding, and not surprisingly, it is, wait for it, available as a Confluence template as well. So, if you're Confluence users, fantastic. We have all these blueprints in here ready for you to use, and just a couple of examples on when and why and how you might want to share more about what your project or what your team is doing as well. I'm going to skip the next slide quickly. Somebody in the room is going to know this one. First one was a little tougher. I already see one hand going up. Hold it until I actually read the question, though. All right. So the name Jira I always used to think it was an acronym, right? It was always in uppercase. They've stylized that a bit now. But what is the actual origin of the name Jira? And somebody here apparently has the answer.
It's a Japanese movie called Godzilla. They used to love watching that movie, so they named it after that.
Yeah, I don't know if everyone could hear that, but basically Jira is a contraction of Gojira, which is Japanese for Godzilla, and they just shrunk it down to Jira, and the name stuck. So when Atlassian first started, before we had Jira, the bug tracking tool they used was Bugzilla, and the developers came to call it by its Japanese name, Gojira, and then eventually, in true Aussie fashion, they just shortened it to one syllable, because Australian, and they just said Jira. So Jira was the name that stuck. So it's interesting to see that a product name has a weird history around it like that as well. I knew somebody in the room was going to know that. There's always one person. I think only a couple times somebody's gotten the first question right, but there's always at least one in the crowd who knows about the origin of Jira. One of the last things I'll call out in the team playbooks, because there are a number of elements around that, is as you figure out where you're going, as you run the different plays, as you set up your team poster so everyone knows what you're focused on, you might need to make some key decisions. So has anyone ever heard of a DAISY approach, DAISY chart? Yeah? So driver, approver, contributor, and informed. Basically a way to just structure. Not every decision can be a bit overkill for everything, but really key decisions. It's a way to take group discussions and decisions and make sure they're documented and approached in a timely fashion. And this is good for some of the more contentious debates where you get into a heated discussion on your team and you're just deadlocked and you can't go. Anyone ever been in that mode, right? Great, team delegation to do whatever they want. You're allowed a fair amount of flexibility. But if you're working on a team of high performers, sometimes compromise is in their vocabulary that day, right? It can be a bit difficult to actually make a decision and move forward. DAISY's meant to help break through that. So it gives you a way to, again, come back to that shared understanding, like just deep breath, what are we doing this for? To structure the decision making and to ensure that you're including the right people as part of that chat. And sometimes that might mean including people outside your team as well. A lot of individuals on the team might be involved as contributors and others would be informed. But who needs to approve it? Who's really driving the discussion around it? That's quite often somebody higher up on the management chain and or in another team. So we've done this for some of our key product decisions internally. I've seen it internally in my organization just in terms of, I don't want to say just tiebreakers, but if we ever need someone higher up in the food chain to give us a clearer direction on something, DAISY's a great way to document that. And so they're part of the playbook as well, and they're used across a number of different types of teams, whether it's engineering or designers or HR, or there's a variety of different ways in which this might actually be used. And again, what are we looking at here? How is this packaged up? I've already said it twice. It's a Confluence template or a blueprint, right? So all of these are there as a PDF. If you don't happen to be using Confluence, we give you PDF versions of this as well. If you do have Confluence, you can also use the blueprints to get going with this also. All of these are available to you on the Atlassian Team Playbook site. Definitely take a look. Again, it's out there for a number of teams. It is more than just marketing material. It's something we continue to use internally. It is the result of a lot of iterations on our part, a lot of lessons learned, a lot of experiences, a lot of best practices on how to really shape the best way for your team to work. And then once you've got that house in order, then you can start looking at the right tools and products and how do you ramp it up to the next level from there. So we use it, our major customers use it, we package that up, we've now made them available for all of you, whether or not you use Atlassian. You know, this is just good, take care of your team, hygiene type of things. And that is the last thing that I will be covering for you today. And again, I appreciate the investments that you've made in your time here. And I think next we'll be moving on to another part of the agenda as well, right? All right, thank you.